Picture a quaint English village where the willow tea-room's silver teapots gleam with secrets. When wealthy Gerald Ashton collapses mid-sip, poisoned by cyanide, suspicion falls on the nervous owner Clara, the resentful waiter Tommy, and the vengeful tea merchant Redding. Enter Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unravelling a web of grudges, love and betrayal. In just 12 chapters, a single scratched teapot reveals a chilling truth, proving that in St. Mary's, even a cup of tea can be deadly. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village of St. Mary's, the village of St. Mary's lay nestled in a gentle fold of the English countryside, where the seasons turned with a predictability that comforted its residents. Cottages of weathered stone, their chimneys puffing soft curls of smoke, lined the narrow lanes. Ivy clung possessively to garden walls, and the church spire pierced the sky with quiet authority. At the heart of the village stood the willow tea-room, its bow windows agleam with the promise of warmth and gossip. It was here, in this unassuming haven, that death had slipped in, uninvited, on a crisp autumn afternoon. Miss Jane Marple, a guest in St. Mary's at the invitation of her old friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, sat in the latter's parlour at Gossington Hall. The fire crackled, casting a glow on the chintz curtains and the polished mahogany table, where a silver tea-tray gleamed. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with rhythmic precision, the pale pink wool of a shawl pooling in her lap. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, missed nothing. Not the faint tremor in Mrs. Bantry's voice as she recounted the morning's scandal, nor the way the housemaid Mary lingered at the door, eager for scraps of news. "It's dreadful, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, her hands fluttering over her teacup. "Mr. Ashton, Gerald Ashton, you know, that financier from London, dropped dead right there in the willow tea-room. One moment he was sipping his tea, and the next—" She trailed off, shuddering. "They're saying it was poison. Cyanide, the doctor thinks. Can you imagine? In St. Mary's." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment as she tilted her head. Her white hair, neatly pinned, caught the firelight, and her expression remained serene, though her mind was already turning. "Poison," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that belied her gentle demeanour. "That is a very deliberate choice, Dolly." "It's not like a knife or a gun. Impulsive things. Poison requires thought, planning, and I dare say a certain intimacy with the victim's habits." Mrs. Bantry blinked, her round face creasing with unease. "Intimacy? Oh, Jane, you don't think it was someone he knew?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, resuming her knitting, "that we know very little yet. Tell me about Mr. Ashton. What sort of man was he?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes alight with the relish of sharing village lore. Gerald Ashton, she explained, had retired to St. Mary's some 3 years prior, after a career in London's financial circles. A widower, he lived in a handsome Georgian house just beyond the village green, attended by a housekeeper and a gardener. Wealthy, certainly, but not well liked. His manner was brusque, his tongue sharp, and his habit of meddling in local affairs, whether the church fete or the parish council, had ruffled feathers. "He had a way of making you feel small," Mrs. Bantry confided. "Always knew better than everyone else." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily. "A man like that," she murmured, "tends to collect enemies, as others collect stamps." "And the tea-room? Did he frequent it?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Bantry said. "He went nearly every day, always ordering the same thing, Earl Grey, no milk, 1 sugar. Clara Henshaw, the owner, fussed over him terribly. I think she rather liked his attention, poor dear. She's a widow, you know, and not used to flattery." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "And others? Were there others in the village who took issue with Mr. Ashton?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Well, there's Lawrence Redding, the tea merchant. He has that little shop, the Saffron Leaf, across the square. They say Ashton ruined him. Something about investments gone wrong. And young Tommy Pierce, the waiter at the Willow, didn't care for him either. Ashton was always complaining about the service. Called Tommy careless once, loud enough for everyone to hear." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained mild. "A tea merchant, a tea room owner, and a waiter," she said thoughtfully. "How curious that it all circles around tea. And yet, poison in a public place. Such a bold act. One wonders." She trailed off, her needles moving faster now, as if keeping pace with her thoughts. Mrs. Bantry, accustomed to her friend's cryptic musings, pressed on. "The police are there now, Jane. Inspector Craddock. You remember him from that business with the vicar. He's poking about, asking questions, but it's all so shocking. Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside and folded her hands. "Who, indeed?" she said. "But I find, Dolly, that people are rarely as mysterious as they seem. In a village like St. Mary's, secrets have a way of bubbling up, like tea leaves in a pot. Perhaps I shall take a stroll to the Willow tomorrow. A cup of tea might be illuminating." Mrs. Bantry stared, half in awe, half in apprehension. "Jane, you're not thinking of getting involved, are you?" Miss Marple smiled, a small, knowing smile. "I am merely an old lady with a fondness for tea," she said. But her eyes, sharp as ever, told a different story, one of curiosity, resolve, and a quiet certainty that the truth, like a well-steeped brew, would soon reveal itself. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The Willow Tea Room stood at the corner of St. Mary's High Street, its whitewashed facade and mullioned windows exuding an air of timeless charm. A sign above the door, painted in delicate gold script, swayed gently in the autumn breeze, and the faint tinkle of a bell greeted visitors as they crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of freshly baked scones and the subtle perfume of loose-leaf tea. On any other day, the clink of china and the murmur of polite conversation would have filled the space. But this morning, the tea-room was silent save for the low voices of Inspector Craddock and his constables, who moved with the careful deliberation of men tasked with unravelling a mystery. Miss Jane Marple, invited by the inspector to observe under the pretext of her keen eye for village matters, stepped into the tea-room with her usual unassuming grace. Her black lace-up shoes made no sound on the polished oak floor, and her gloved hands clasped a small handbag, its contents limited to a handkerchief, a few coins, and a notebook she never admitted to carrying. Her eyes, bright and inquisitive behind her spectacles, swept the room, taking in every detail. The starched damask tablecloths, the gleaming silver teaspoons, the framed watercolours of lavender fields on the walls. The tea-room was a place of order, of ritual, and yet Miss Marple thought it had become a stage for something far darker. Inspector Craddock, a tall man with a weathered face and a manner that balanced professionalism with a touch of deference to Miss Marple's reputation, greeted her near the door. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I'm grateful you could come. It's a queer business, this. Not the sort of thing we expect in Saint." Mary's Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of mild curiosity, though her mind was already cataloguing the scene. "Murder inspector is never expected," she said softly, "but it has a way of finding even the quietest corners. May I see where it happened?" Craddock led her to a small table in the far corner, tucked beneath a window that overlooked the village green. The table was set for one, its cloth pristine save for a faint ring where a teacup had rested. The cup itself, a delicate piece of bone china with a pattern of forget-me-nots, sat on its saucer, half filled with a murky amber liquid. A silver teapot, its spout gleaming, stood beside it, and a single sugar cube remained untouched in a tiny dish. Miss Marple leaned closer, her nose wrinkling at a faint, acrid scent. Bitter, like almonds, but not quite. Cyanide, she thought, recalling Mrs. Bantry's account. It was a scent she had encountered once before, years ago, in a case involving a jilted lover and a bottle of ratafia. "The body was found here," Craddock said, gesturing to the chair now empty. Mr. Ashton was sitting, sipping his tea, when he clutched his chest and fell forward. "Dead in moments," the doctor says. No one saw anything unusual until he collapsed. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the teacup, then moved to the teapot. "And this was his usual table?" she asked. "Yes," Craddock replied. "Mrs. Henshaw, Clara, the owner, said he always sat here." Liked the view. Apparently Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. The green beyond was dotted with villagers going about their morning, their heads bowed in hushed conversation. News of Ashton's death had spread like wildfire, and she could almost hear the whispers. Poison! Murder! In the willow tea-room of all places. She turned back to the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the cloth. "Who served him?" she asked. "Young Tommy Pierce," Craddock said, nodding toward a lanky youth standing near the counter, his apron crumpled and his face pale. "He's the waiter here. Says he brought the tea as usual." Nothing out of the ordinary Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Tommy, who was twisting a cloth in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floor. "And Mrs. Henshaw?" she asked. "She prepared the tea herself," Craddock said. "Insisted on it, apparently. Ashton was particular about his Earl Grey. She's over there, if you'd like to speak with her." Clara Henshaw stood behind the counter, her hands clasped tightly, her knuckles white. A woman in her late 40s, she had a delicate, almost fragile beauty, with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a lace cap. Her eyes, however, were red-rimmed, and her lips trembled as she answered a constable's questions. Miss Marple approached, her steps slow and deliberate, her smile one of gentle reassurance. "Mrs. Henshaw," she said, her voice warm. "What a terrible shock this must be. I wonder if you might tell me about yesterday. Mr. Ashton was a regular, I understand?" Clara's eyes darted to Miss Marple, then away. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He came every morning, always at 10. He liked his tea just so. Earl Grey, brewed for exactly 3 minutes, 1 sugar. I made it myself, as I always did. I'd never do anything to harm him." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Of course not, my dear. But it must be difficult running such a place alone. Did anyone else handle the tea? Or perhaps the teapot? Clara shook her head vehemently. No, no one. I keep everything spotless. The teapot was clean, the leaves fresh from the caddy. I don't understand how— Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple patted her arm gently. There, you've had a dreadful time. Just one more question, if I may. Was anyone else near Mr. Ashton's table yesterday? Anyone who seemed out of place? Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering with something Miss Marple couldn't quite read. No, she said at last. It was a quiet morning. Just the usual customers. Miss Grey, the spinster from Rose, Cottage, and a couple from out of town. No one went near his table except Tommy to serve the tea. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back, her mind turning over Clara's words. The woman's nervousness was palpable, but was it guilt, fear, or simply the strain of the moment? She glanced at Tommy, who had moved to wipe down a nearby table, his movements jerky and distracted. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with him later, but for now her attention returned to the teapot. "Inspector," she said, beckoning Craddock over. "This teapot, has it been examined?" "Not yet," he admitted. "We've sent the cup and saucer to the lab, but the teapot was empty by the time we arrived. Mrs. Henshaw said she washed it after the incident, out of habit." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, though her expression remained mild. "A pity," she murmured, "but perhaps not entirely surprising. Tell me, was the tea-room busy yesterday?" Craddock consulted his notebook. "Not particularly." Mrs. Henshaw said there were only a handful of customers. Miss Lavinia Gray was here, as Clara mentioned, and a couple from London, tourists, they said. We've got their names. Oh, and there was talk of Lawrence Redding being seen nearby, though not inside. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Mr. Redding, the tea merchant. That's the one," Craddock said. "He and Ashton had bad blood, from what I hear. Something about a business deal gone sour. Redding's shop, the Saffron Leaf, supplies the Willow's tea, but he and Ashton were at loggerheads. Witnesses saw them arguing in the square last week." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. "And the tea itself? Where was it kept?" "In a locked caddy behind the counter," Craddock said. "Mrs. Henshaw has the only key. She's particular about her blends." Apparently, Miss Marple's eyes returned to the teapot, its silver surface catching the light. She leaned closer, noting a faint scratch near the spout, barely visible unless one looked for it. "Curious," she said softly, almost to herself. "A teapot is such a personal thing, isn't it? It holds the essence of the ritual. And yet, it can hide so much." Craddock looked at her, puzzled. "You think the teapot's important?" "I think," Miss Marple said, straightening, "that everything in a tea-room is important. The cups, the spoons, the leaves, each plays its part. And poison, Inspector, is a very particular guest. It doesn't wander in by chance. It's invited." She moved to the counter, where Tommy was now stacking saucers with exaggerated care. "Tommy, dear," she said, her tone that of a kindly aunt, "you must be dreadfully upset. Serving Mr. Ashton yesterday. Did anything strike you as unusual?" Tommy's hands froze, and he glanced at her, his freckled face flushing. "No, ma'am," he said quickly. "I just brought the tea like always." "He was reading his paper, same as every day. Didn't say much, just grunted when I set the cup down." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gentle but piercing. "And the teapot? Did you touch it?" "No, ma'am," Tommy said, his voice rising slightly. "Mrs. Henshaw poured it herself. I only carried the tray." Miss Marple nodded, patting his arm. "You're a good boy, Tommy. Don't let this trouble you too much." But as she turned away, her mind was racing. Tommy's nervousness, Clara's insistence on pouring the tea, the locked caddy, the scratched teapot. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. She wandered to the window, looking out at the village green. Across the square, she could just make out the faded sign of the Saffron Leaf, Lawrence Redding's shop. His name had come up twice now, and Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss coincidence. A man with a grudge, a tea-room with a locked caddy, and a dead man who drank only Earl Grey. It was a puzzle, and she felt the familiar stir of curiosity, like a kettle beginning to simmer. "Inspector," she said, turning back to Craddock, "I wonder if you might arrange for me to speak with Miss Grey. She sounds like a lady who notices things." Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "I'll send for her." "Anything else, Miss Marple?" "For now," she said, her smile serene, "I think I shall have a cup of tea. Chamomile, perhaps. It's soothing, and I find it helps one think." As she settled at a nearby table, a fresh cup of tea before her, Miss Marple's eyes returned to the corner where Gerald Ashton had met his end. The tea-room was a place of comfort, of routine, but beneath its polished surface she sensed currents of resentment, fear, and perhaps something deeper. Something that had led to a carefully planned act of murder. She sipped her tea, its warmth spreading through her, and thought of her own village, St. Mary Mead, where secrets like tea leaves always rose to the surface in time. Chapter 3. The Victim's Shadow. The late morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Bantry's parlour at Gossington Hall, casting delicate patterns on the polished floorboards. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair, her knitting needles moving with a quiet rhythm, as she worked on the pale pink shawl, now nearly complete. Across from her, Mrs. Bantry perched on the edge of a chintz-covered sofa, her hands clasped around a cup of tea, her eyes alight with the thrill of recounting village gossip. The air was thick with the scent of lavender from a bowl on the mantel, but the conversation had turned to a darker subject, the life and death of Gerald Ashton. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing, "you mentioned Mr. Ashton was not a popular man. I wonder if you might tell me more about him. What sort of life did he lead here in St. Mary's?" Mrs. Bantry set her cup down with a clink, eager to oblige. "Oh, Jane, he was a most disagreeable man, though I suppose one shouldn't speak ill of the dead. He came to St. Mary's 3 years ago, after his wife passed. Eleanor, poor thing. He bought that big house, Willow Grange, and set himself up as a sort of country gentleman. But he hadn't the manner for it. Always barking orders at his housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, or lecturing the gardener about the roses. He treated the village like his personal fiefdom." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing slightly behind her spectacles. "His wife, you say? Eleanor, what was she like?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A lovely woman, by all accounts, but delicate. Some said she was never the same after marrying Ashton. He was old, you'd see, and not kind, not the way a husband ought to be. There were rumours." She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting the housemaid to appear. Well, people said he was cruel, in private. Not bruises, you understand, but words, coldness. Eleanor faded away, they say, long before she died of pneumonia. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy, though her mind was already turning over the implications. A man who could break a wife with words might break others in different ways. And after her death, did Mr. Ashton seek companionship? Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You mean Clara Henshaw? Oh, Jane, it was the talk of the village. He'd go to the Willow Tea Room every morning, sit at his corner table, and Clara would flutter about him like a moth to a flame. She's a widow herself, you know, and lonely, I dare say. Ashton could be charming when he chose, flattering her scones, complimenting her tea blends. I saw it myself once, the way he'd smile at her, all teeth and no warmth. It made my skin crawl. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, though her eyes remained sharp. And how did Clara respond to his attentions? She lapped it up, Mrs. Bantry said, then caught herself. Not that I blame her, poor dear. Running that tea-room alone is no small task, and Ashton was wealthy, influential, but I think she sensed he wasn't sincere. Once I heard her tell Mrs. Finch she found his compliments unsettling, though she laughed it off. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click-click a counterpoint to her thoughts. And others in the village? You mentioned Lawrence Redding and young Tommy Pierce. Were there others who crossed paths with Mr. Ashton? Mrs. Bantry leaned back, her brow furrowing. Well, Lawrence Redding, of course. Everyone knows about their feud. Redding's tea shop, the Saffron Leaf, was doing well enough until Ashton got involved. You see, Ashton had investments in some big tea company in London, and he used his influence to undercut Redding's suppliers. Nearly drove the Saffron Leaf out of business. Last week, they had a dreadful row in the square. Redding shouting that Ashton would pay for it. I wasn't there, but Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, heard it all. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. A public argument! That's bold, for a village like St. Mary's and Tommy Pierce. Mrs. Bantry sighed. Poor Tommy. He's a good lad, saving for university, but Ashton treated him like a servant. Always complaining, the tea's too cold, the service is slow. Once, Ashton humiliated him in front of the whole tea-room, called him a clumsy oaf when he spilled a drop of cream. Tommy was scarlet with embarrassment. I saw it myself, Jane, and I felt for him. He's got a temper, that boy, but he's not the sort to... well, you know. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the details. A financier with a knack for making enemies. A tea-room owner susceptible to flattery. A young waiter nursing a grudge, and a rival with a ruined business. Each was a piece in the puzzle, but the picture was far from clear. And were there others? She asked. Anyone else who might have wished Mr. Ashton harm? Mrs. Bantry hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Well, there's talk, of course. You know how villages are. Some say Ashton had dealings with unsavoury types in London. Businessmen he'd crossed, perhaps even creditors. He was wealthy, but wealth like that doesn't come without strings, does it? And then there's Miss Lavinia Gray, though I can't imagine her involved. She's a spinster, lives at Rose Cottage, always at the tea-room with her notebook, scribbling goodness knows what. She never liked Ashton, said he was vulgar, but she's harmless, surely. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Miss Gray. Yes, I've heard her name mentioned. A lady who notices things. I understand Mrs. Bantry laughed, a short, nervous sound. Oh, she notices everything, Jane. Nothing escapes her. Why, she once told me she knew the exact day Mrs. Price changed her butcher's supplier, just from the way the sausages looked on her plate. But poison? No, I can't see it. Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene, but her mind alight. People who notice things are often the key to unlocking secrets, Dolly. They see what others miss. I think I should like to meet Miss Gray, and perhaps visit the Saffron Leaf, to see what Mr. Redding has to say about his disagreement with Mr. Ashton. Mrs. Bantry stared, her teacup forgotten. Jane, you're not poking your nose into this, are you? It's police business, after all. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile unwavering. I am merely an old lady with a fondness for tea and conversation, she said. But I find, Dolly, that conversation often reveals more than one expects. Like a garden, you see. Turn over the soil, and you find all sorts of things hidden beneath. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. I think I shall take a walk this afternoon. The village is so lovely, this time of year, and a chat with a neighbour is always refreshing. Mrs. Bantry watched her go, a mixture of admiration and apprehension in her eyes. Be careful, Jane, she called after her. Poison is such a nasty business. Miss Marple paused at the door, her hand on the knob. It is, she agreed, her voice soft but firm. But nastiness, Dolly, has a way of betraying itself. In time, as she stepped into the crisp autumn air, Miss Marple's mind was already weaving together the threads of what she'd learned. Gerald Ashton, a man of wealth and cruelty, had left a trail of resentment in St. Mary's, a trail that led to a poisoned cup of tea. Clara Henshaw's fluttered blushes, Tommy Pierce's wounded pride, Lawrence Redding's public threats, and Miss Gray's watchful eyes. Each was a clue, a shadow cast by the victim's life. And shadows, Miss Marple knew, often pointed to the truth. She adjusted her hat and set off toward the village, her steps light but purposeful. The willow tea-room loomed in her thoughts, its polished teapots and starched tablecloths hiding something far less innocent. A man like Ashton, she murmured to herself, stirs passions, and passions left to simmer can turn deadly. Chapter 4. The Owner's Tale. The High Street of St. Mary's was a picture of autumnal calm as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward the willow tea-room. The leaves, tinged with gold and crimson, rustled underfoot, and the air carried the faint tang of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Villagers nodded politely as she passed, their smiles tinged with curiosity, for news of her interest in the Ashton case had begun to ripple through St. Mary's. Miss Marple, her black coat neatly buttoned and her hat tilted just so, appeared as nothing more than an elderly spinster out for a stroll, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, not the furtive glance of a shopkeeper, nor the hurried whisper of two women by the post office. The willow tea-room, though open for business, had an air of unease. The bell above the door gave a muted jingle as Miss Marple entered, and the few patrons inside, a pair of elderly sisters sharing a pot of tea and a lone gentleman reading a newspaper, glanced up briefly before returning to their preoccupations. The room was as immaculate as ever, its tables adorned with crisp linens and gleaming silver. But the usual hum of chatter was absent, replaced by a strained silence. behind the counter stood Mrs. Clara Henshaw, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her hands busy arranging a tray of scones with a precision that betrayed her nerves. Miss Marple approached, her smile warm and disarming. "Mrs. Henshaw," she said, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of a trusted confidant. "I couldn't resist stopping by for one of your famous scones, and perhaps a cup of tea. Chamomile, if you please. It's such a soothing blend, don't you think?" Clara's lips twitched into a fleeting smile, though her eyes remained guarded. "Of course, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but strained. "I'll have Tommy bring it to your table. Won't you sit down?" Miss Marple chose a table near the counter, not far from where Gerald Ashton had met his end. As she settled into the chair, her handbag resting on her lap, she took in the details of the tea room with a practiced eye. The counter was spotless, its glass jars of tea leaves labelled in Clara's precise handwriting. Darjeeling, Assam, Earl Grey. A small brass key hung on a hook behind the counter, presumably for the locked caddy Craddock had mentioned. The teapots, lined up on a shelf, gleamed in the soft light, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the one that had held Ashton's fatal brew, now back in its place after the police had released it. Its silver surface was unmarred, save for that faint scratch she had noticed the day before. Clara, catching Miss Marple's glance, busied herself with the tea, her hands trembling slightly as she measured out the chamomile. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the way Clara's fingers clutched the spoon, as if anchoring herself against a tide of anxiety. "It must be difficult," Miss Marple said kindly, "to carry on after such a tragedy. The tea-room is your pride and joy. I can see that." Clara's shoulders stiffened, but she nodded. "It is," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've put everything into this place since my husband passed. It's all I have. And now, this." She gestured vaguely, her hand encompassing the room, the tragedy, the whispers that clung to the air like damp fog. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression one of gentle concern. "Mr. Ashton was a regular, I understand. It must have been a shock to lose someone so familiar." Clara's eyes flickered, and she set the teapot down with a faint clink. "He was particular," she said carefully. "Always wanted his Earl Grey just so. 3 minutes steepin', 1 sugar, no milk. I made it myself, every time. He liked that I took the trouble." A flush crept into her cheeks, and she looked away, busying herself with a cloth. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was as sharp as ever. "He must have appreciated your care," she said. "I hear he could be quite charming." A man like that, with his wealth and manner, must have turned many heads. Clara's flush deepened, and she shook her head. "Oh no, it wasn't like that. He was just kind sometimes. He'd say nice things about the tea, the scones, but he could be sharp too. If something wasn't right, he'd let you know." Her voice wavered, and she dabbed at her eyes with the cloth. "I'd never harm him, Miss Marple. I swear it. I don't know how that poison got into his tea." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy, though her thoughts were racing. Clara's nervousness was more than just shock, she sensed. There was a thread of fear, perhaps even guilt, though not necessarily of murder. "Of course, my dear," she said soothingly, "no one imagines you meant any harm. But tell me, did anyone else come near the tea that morning? Perhaps someone in the kitchen, or a customer who lingered?" Clara shook her head, her hands twisting the cloth. "No one. I keep the tea caddy locked. Always have, ever since some leaves went missing last year. I poured the tea myself, from the caddy to the pot. Tommy only carried it to the table. And the customer, well, it was just Miss Gray and those tourists from London. No one went near Mr. Ashton's table. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the brass key on the hook. "A locked caddy," she murmured. "Very wise. And the teapot. Was it the same one you always used for Mr. Ashton?" Clara hesitated, her fingers pausing on the cloth. "Yes," she said at last. "He liked the silver one, said it kept the tea warmer." "I cleaned it thoroughly before using it, like always. I'm very particular about that." Miss Marple smiled, though her mind noted the slight hitch in Clara's voice. "You run a splendid establishment," she said. "It's no wonder, Mr. Ashton came every day. But it must be a strain, managing alone. Do you ever have help besides Tommy?" Clara shook her head. "Just Tommy, and he's only part-time. I do most everything myself. The baking, the tea, the cleaning. It's hard, but I manage." Her voice cracked, and she turned away, pretending to adjust a jar of tea leaves. Miss Marple watched her closely, her mind turning over the details. Clara's devotion to the tea-room was evident, but so was her fragility. A woman stretched thin by grief and responsibility, susceptible to flattery, perhaps even to manipulation. And yet, the locked caddy, the clean teapot, the precise ritual of Ashton's tea, it all pointed to a careful plan, one that Clara, with her trembling hands and tearful eyes, seemed ill-suited to execute. Or was she? Tommy appeared with Miss Marple's tea, setting the cup and saucer down with exaggerated care. "Here you are, ma'am," he said, his voice tight. Miss Marple thanked him, noting the way his eyes darted to Clara, then back to the floor. There was a tension between them, she thought, subtle but present. As she sipped her chamomile, its floral warmth soothing her throat, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the silver teapot on the shelf. The scratch on its spout, so faint as to be nearly invisible, nagged at her. It was a small thing, but small things, she knew, could unravel great mysteries. "Mrs. Henshaw," she said, her tone conversational, "do you ever have trouble with your suppliers? The tea, I mean. It must be difficult to ensure everything is fresh." Clara turned, her expression wary. "Mr. Redding supplies the tea," she said. "His shop, the Saffron Leaf, has the best blends." "He's always been reliable, though." She hesitated, then pressed her lips. Together he and Mr. Ashton didn't get on, but that's no secret. Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging. "Business rivalries can be so tiresome," she said, "but you trust Mr. Redding's tea?" "Of course," Clara said quickly, then faltered. "That is, I've never had reason not to. The leaves come sealed, and I check them myself." Miss Marple took another sip of her tea, her mind cataloguing Clara's words, her hesitations, her glances toward the teapot. There was something here, she thought, a piece of the puzzle not yet in place. Clara's devotion to her tea-room, her care with Ashton's tea, her insistence on innocence. It all fit, and yet it didn't. Poison was a deliberate act, requiring access and intent, and Clara had both. But so perhaps did others. As she finished her tea and rose to leave, Miss Marple paused at the counter. "You've been most kind, Mrs. Henshaw," she said, "and your tea is delightful. I shall have to return soon." Clara managed a weak smile. "You're welcome any time, Miss Marple." Stepping back into the crisp air of the high street, Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, her mind alight with possibilities. Clara Henshaw was a woman under strain, her life woven into the fabric of the tea-room, her heart perhaps stirred by Ashton's charm. But was she a murderer? Or was she, like the teapot, a vessel for someone else's design? Hands, Miss Marple murmured to herself, tell truths that words conceal. And Clara's hands, trembling as they poured the tea, had told her something. Though what, she was not yet certain. Chapter 5. The Waiter's Burden. The afternoon light slanted across the village square of St. Mary's, painting the cobblestones in hues of amber and gold. Miss Jane Marple, her black coat buttoned against the autumn chill, paused outside the willow tea-room, her eyes lingering on the polished windows that reflected the comings and goings of the village. She had decided to linger a little longer, sensing that the tea-room, with its quiet routines and hidden tensions, held more secrets than Clara Henshaw's trembling hands had revealed. Her next task was to speak with Tommy Pierce, the young waiter whose flushed cheeks and nervous demeanour had caught her attention during her earlier visit. Inside, the tea-room was quieter now, the morning's sparse custom having dwindled to a single patron, an elderly man dozing over a cup of tea in the far corner. Tommy was at the counter, polishing a stack of silver teaspoons with a vigour that suggested he was working off more than just tarnish. His lanky frame, clad in a slightly too large apron, moved with the restless energy of youth, but his face was pale, his freckles stark against his skin. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft, her smile as warm and unthreatening as a grandmother's. "Good afternoon, Tommy," she said, settling at a table near the counter and placing her handbag beside her. "I wonder if you might spare a moment. I've just had the loveliest scone, and I thought I'd stay for another cup of tea. Perhaps you could recommend something?" Tommy glanced up, startled, his cloth pausing mid-polish. "Oh, yes, ma'am," he stammered, setting the spoon down with a clatter. "The chamomile's nice, like you had before. Or maybe a peppermint. It's refreshing." "Peppermint will do splendidly," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with gentle encouragement. "And do sit for a moment, if Mrs. Henshaw can spare you. It's so rare to find a young man with such dedication to his work." Tommy hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen door, where Clara was out of sight, preparing a batch of dough. He wiped his hands on his apron and pulled out a chair, sitting stiffly, as if expecting a reprimand. "Mrs. Henshaw's particular about things," he said, his voice low. "But she's fair. I don't want to cause her any trouble." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, folding her hands in her lap. "This business with Mr. Ashton must be terribly upsetting for you both. Serving him that day, such a dreadful thing to witness." Tommy's hands twitched, and he looked down at the table, his fingers tracing a seam in the cloth. "It was awful, ma'am," he said. "He was just sitting there, like always, reading his paper." I brought the tea, set it down, and went back to the counter. Then he made this noise, like a choke, and fell forward. I didn't know what to do. Mrs. Henshaw screamed, and Miss Gray, she was there. She called for the doctor. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy, though her mind was cataloguing every word, every gesture. "It must have been a shock," she said. "Mr. Ashton was a regular, I understand. Did he often speak to you when you served him?" Tommy's face tightened, a flush creeping up his neck. "Not much," he said. "He wasn't one for chatting." always had his nose in the paper or barking orders. "Hurry up, boy," or "don't dawdle," that sort of thing. Once Tommy stopped, his jaw clenching. "Go on, dear," Miss Marple said softly, her tone as soothing as the peppermint tea Tommy had just brought, its steam curling between them. "It's all right to speak plainly." Tommy exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "He embarrassed me," he said, his voice barely audible. "A few weeks ago, I spilled a bit of cream on his table. Not much, just a drop. He called me a clumsy oaf in front of everyone. Said I'd never amount to anything if I couldn't even pour properly. Everyone was staring, and Mrs. Henshaw had to calm him down. I hated him for it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp, noting the raw edge in Tommy's voice. "That must have been very hard," she said. "Young men feel such things deeply." "But you carried on serving him, didn't you? That shows character." Tommy shrugged, his fingers twisting the edge of his apron. "Had to. It's my job. I'm saving for university, see? Can't afford to lose it. Besides, Mrs. Henshaw depends on me. She's been good to me, even when I make mistakes." Miss Marple sipped her tea, its minty warmth spreading through her, and observed Tommy closely. His resentment was clear, but it was the resentment of youth, hot and fleeting, not the cold calculation required for poison. Still, she thought, youth could be impulsive, and Tommy had been at the heart of the tea room's routine, carrying that fatal tray. "Tell me," she said, her tone conversational, "when you brought Mr. Ashton's tea that morning, was it just as Mrs. Henshaw prepared it? Nothing added, nothing changed?" Tommy's eyes widened, and he leaned back, his hands gripping the table. "Nothing, Mum, I swear. I just took the tray from her. Teapot, cup, sugar dish, all as she set it. I didn't even touch the tea. I didn't like him, but I'd never—" His voice cracked, and he looked away, his freckles standing out against his flushed cheeks. Miss Marple patted his hand gently, her touch light but reassuring. There, Tommy. No one's accusing you. I'm only trying to understand how things work here. The tea room is such a busy place, isn't it? So many hands, so many cups. It must be hard to keep track of everything." Tommy nodded, relaxing slightly. "It can be. Mornings are quiet, but some days we're run off our feet. Mrs. Henshaw's particular about the tea, though. She keeps the caddy locked, and she's the only one who pours for Mr. Ashton says he trusts her to get it right." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her smile remained serene. "How thoughtful of her," she said. "And the teapot? Did you notice anything unusual about it that day? Perhaps it looked different, or was placed somewhere odd." Tommy frowned, his brow furrowing as he thought. "No, ma'am. It was the silver one, same as always. Mr. Ashton liked it best. I just carried it to the table and set it down. Didn't even look inside." He hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Henshaw washed it right after, though. Said it was habit, with the police coming, and all Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly, though her expression betrayed no concern. The washed teapot again, she thought, a detail that nagged at her like a loose stitch in her knitting. "You're a great help, Tommy," she said, rising from her chair. "And don't worry yourself too much. These things have a way of sorting themselves out." Tommy managed a weak smile, standing to clear her cup. "Thank you, ma'am. I just want this all to be over. It's not right what happened to Mr. Ashton, but I don't want Mrs. Henshaw to suffer for it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the boy as he returned to the counter. his shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight far heavier than a tea tray. She stepped outside, the cool air brushing her cheeks, and paused to consider what she had learned. Tommy's resentment was real, but it was the bruised pride of a young man, not the deep-seated hatred that poison required. His role as the waiter gave him opportunity, certainly, but his insistence on not touching the tea itself rang true. And yet, the teapot, washed so quickly, and Clara's exclusive handling of Ashton's tea, these were threads that needed untangling. As she walked back toward Gossington Hall, Miss Marple's mind turned to the broader picture. Gerald Ashton's shadow loomed large, his sharp tongue and ruthless dealings casting ripples through the village. Tommy's humiliation, Clara's flustered devotion, and Lawrence Redding's ruined business were all pieces of the same puzzle. But the key, she felt, lay in the tea-room's rituals, the locked caddy, the silver teapot, the precise steeping of Earl Grey. Youth, she murmured to herself, is impulsive, but poison is patient. And patience, I think, is what we're looking for. Adjusting her hat, she glanced across the square toward the saffron leaf, its faded sign a silent testament to Lawrence Redding's struggles. Tommy had given her much to ponder, but it was Redding, she decided, who warranted her next visit. A man with a grudge as deep as his was not to be overlooked, and Miss Marple had a knack for coaxing truths from even the most guarded hearts. Chapter 6. The Rival's Motive. The village square of St. Mary's, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, hummed with the quiet rhythm of daily life. A grocer swept his doorstep, children darted past with schoolbags swinging, and the church clock chimed the hour with solemn precision. Across from the Willow Tea Room, its rival establishment, the Saffron Leaf, stood in modest contrast. Its sign, once vibrant, was weathered to a pale ochre, and the windows, though clean, lacked the polished sparkle of Clara Henshaw's domain. Miss Jane Marple, her steps measured but purposeful, crossed the square, her black handbag tucked under her arm, and her eyes alert beneath the brim of her hat. She had decided that Lawrence Redding, the tea merchant with a grudge against Gerald Ashton, was the next thread to unravel in the tapestry of this peculiar murder. The bell above the Saffron Leaf store gave a muted clang as she entered, and the air was heavy with the earthy scent of tea leaves, jasmine, oolong, and the sharp citrus note of bergamot. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with tins and jars, each labelled in a bold, if slightly faded hand. Behind the counter stood Lawrence Redding, a man in his early 40s, his dark hair streaked with grey, and his broad shoulders had hunched as he sorted through a ledger. His face, handsome in a rugged way, was set in a scowl, and his eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a wariness that bordered on defiance. "Good afternoon, Mr. Redding," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm and unassuming as a village gossip's. "I've heard such fine things about your tea blends. I thought I might browse a little, perhaps find something for my friend Mrs. Bantry. She's partial to chamomile, but I'm open to suggestions." Redding's scowl softened, though his eyes remained guarded. "Chamomile's a good choice," he said, his voice gruff but polite. "I've a new blend from Dorset, very soothing. Or perhaps a jasmine green if she likes something lighter." He gestured to a row of tins, his hands calloused from years of handling tea chests. Miss Marple moved to the shelves, her fingers brushing the cool metal of a tin as she studied the labels. "What a charming shop," she said, her tone conversational. "It must be a labour of love, keeping such a variety. I understand you supply the willow tea room as well." Redding's jaw tightened, and he set the ledger down with a thud. "I do," he said curtly. "Clara Henshaw's been a customer for years. Reliable, pays on time." Not like some Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her expression remained serene. "You mean Mr. Ashton, perhaps? I've heard he was difficult in business matters." Redding's hands stilled, and he looked at her sharply, as if assessing whether she was merely a curious old lady or something more. "Difficult's putting it mildly," he said at last, his voice low and bitter. "Ashton was a vulture. He didn't just compete, he destroyed. Got his claws into my suppliers, undercut my prices with his fancy London connections, nearly ran me out of business. The saffron leaf's been my family's for 2 generations, and he treated it like a game." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to a tin of Earl Grey, its label identical to those she'd seen at the Willow. "That must have been terribly trying," she said. "I heard you had words with him recently, in the square. It's hard to keep tempers in check when so much is at stake." Redding's face darkened, and he leaned forward, his hands gripping the counter. "Words? Aye, we had words. Last week I caught him smirking outside my shop, bold as brass. I told him he'd pay for what he'd done, not with his life, mind you, but in coin, in reputation. I'm no murderer, Miss Marple, whatever the village tongues are wagging." His voice was fierce, but there was a tremor beneath it, a crack in his defiance. "Of course not," Miss Marple said soothingly, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "No one's suggesting such a thing." "But it's curious, isn't it, how things happen? Mr. Ashton taking his tea at the Willow, with your leaves in the pot. You must be proud of your blends to have them so trusted." Redding's eyes narrowed, and he straightened, his posture rigid. "I supply the tea, nothing more. Clara checks every batch herself. She's particular like that. If you're hinting at poison, you're barking up the wrong tree. I wasn't even near the Willow that day." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile as gentle as ever. "Oh, I'm not hinting, Mr. Redding. I'm only an old lady who likes to understand things. You see, in my village, Saint Mary Mead, we had a case once, a jar of preserves tampered with ever so cleverly. It wasn't the supplier, of course, but the way the jar was handled afterward. It made me think of teapots and caddies and how easily things can be overlooked." Redding stared at her, his expression a mix of suspicion and unease. "My tea's clean," he said flatly. "I seal every tin myself, and Clara's got the only key to her caddy. If there was poison, it wasn't from me." Miss Marple nodded, selecting a tin of chamomile and placing it on the counter. "I'm sure you're right," she said. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Redding. I'll take this for Mrs. Bantry. She'll be delighted. And do take care. These are trying times for everyone." As she paid for the tea, her eyes lingered on Redding's hands, strong, steady, but with a faint tremor as he wrapped the tin in brown paper. She thanked him and stepped back into the square, the tin tucked into her handbag. The air was cooler now, the sun dipping toward the horizon, and Miss Marple paused to consider what she had learned. Lawrence Redding's anger was raw, his motive clear, a business ruined, a pride wounded. His denial of being near the Willow that day was firm, but Miss Marple knew that denials, like tea leaves, could obscure as much as they revealed. She thought of the Earl Grey, supplied by Redding, used in Ashton's fatal tea. The locked caddy, the silver teapot, Clara's careful rituals, all pointed to a narrow window of opportunity. Redding's claim that he sealed the tins himself was plausible, but access to the tea-room stores, even briefly, could change everything. And then there was the argument in the square, witnessed by half the village, a public display of fury that suggested passion, not patience. Anger, Miss Marple murmured to herself, is a spark, but poison is a slow burn. And Mr. Redding, I think, burns brightly. Her thoughts turned to Miss Lavinia Grey, the spinster who noticed everything. If Redding had been near the willow, even briefly, Miss Grey might have seen him. And if not, her sharp eyes might have caught something else. A glance, a gesture, a moment out of place. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and set off toward Rose Cottage, her mind weaving the threads of the case together. Lawrence Redding's motive was strong, but motive alone was not enough. The truth, she knew, lay in the details. The scratch on a teapot, the key to a caddy, the shadow of a man's past, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. Chapter 7. The Guest Who Saw Too Much. The path to Rose Cottage wound through a quiet lane on the edge of St. Mary's, where hedgerows bristled with late blackberries and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves. Miss Jane Marple walked with her usual unhurried grace, her black handbag swinging gently at her side, her eyes taking in the details of the village as if it were her own saint, Mary Mead. The cottage itself was a modest affair, its thatched roof sagging slightly, and its garden a riot of chrysanthemums and late roses. A wooden gate creaked as she pushed it open, and she noted the neatly swept path leading to the door, a sign, she thought, of a meticulous occupant. Miss Lavinia Grey, the spinster of Rose Cottage, was known in Saint. Mary's for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes. Mrs. Bantry had described her as a woman who noticed everything, and Miss Marple, with her knack for recognizing the value of such observers, had decided a visit was essential. She knocked softly, and the door opened to reveal Miss Grey, a slight figure in a tweed skirt and cardigan, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes, small and bright as a wren's, appraised Miss Marple with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Miss Marple," Miss Grey said, her voice crisp but not unkind. "I've heard you're staying with Mrs. Bantry. Come to poke about in this dreadful business with Mr. Ashton, I presume?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as disarming as ever. "Oh, hardly poking, Miss Grey," she said, her tone light. "I'm merely an old lady, with a fondness for tea and conversation. Mrs. Bantry tells me you're a regular at the Willow Tea Room, and I thought you might share a cup with me. I do so enjoy hearing about village life." Miss Grey's lips twitched, as if she saw through the pretense, but was willing to play along. "Very well," she said, stepping aside. "I've a pot of Darjeeling just brewed." "Come in." The parlour was small but immaculate, with lace doilies on every surface, and a writing desk cluttered with notebooks and pens. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, her handbag on her lap, and accepted a cup of tea, its rich aroma mingling with the faint scent of lavender from a vase on the table. Miss Grey sat opposite, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly as if guarding her thoughts. "You were at the Willow Tea Room the morning Mr. Ashton died," Miss Marple said, her voice conversational, as if discussing the weather. "It must have been a terrible shock." Miss Grey's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. "It was." One moment he was sitting there, reading his paper as usual, and the next he was gasping, clutching his chest. Clara screamed, and that boy Tommy froze like a statue. I called for Dr. Haydock myself, though it was far too late, of course. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Miss Grey's face. "You're very observant, I hear," she said. "It's a gift, isn't it, noticing the little things?" "In my village, we had a Miss Weatherby, such an eye for detail. She could tell you who passed her window at what hour, and what they were carrying. I imagine you saw quite a bit that morning." Miss Grey's lips pursed, a flicker of pride crossing her face. "I do notice things," she admitted. "People think I'm just a fussy old woman, scribbling in my notebook, but I see what goes on, and I don't forget." She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "That morning, for instance, I saw Clara whispering with Mr. Ashton a few days prior. Something about a private matter." She looked flustered, not herself. "And then there was Lawrence Redding." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted, though her expression remained serene. "Mr. Redding? Was he in the tea-room?" "Not inside," Miss Grey said, her tone sharp with precision. "But I saw him outside, lingering by the door just before 10. He didn't come in, just stood there, looking through the window. I thought it odd, given how he and Ashton were at odds. Everyone knows about their row in the square." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. "Very odd indeed," she said. "And did you notice anything else? Perhaps something about the tea or the way it was served?" Miss Grey's eyes gleamed, as if relishing the chance to share her observations. "Clara poured the tea herself, as she always did for Ashton. She's particular about it, says he liked it just so. Tommy brought the tray, but he didn't touch the pot. I watched him set it down, and Ashton poured his own cup. No one else went near the table, not even Clara. But," she hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Go on," Miss Marple said gently, her voice as soothing as the Darjeeling. "Even the smallest thing can matter." Miss Grey leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There was a moment, just before Tommy brought the tray, when Clara was in the kitchen. I heard a clatter, like something metal hitting the floor. She came out looking pale, but she said it was just a spoon. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" She trailed off, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly, though her mind was racing. A clatter in the kitchen, a pale-faced Clara, a teapot that was later washed. These were fragments, but they fit into the pattern she was beginning to see. "You're a great help, Miss Grey," she said. "People like you, who notice the little things, make all the difference. Did Mr. Ashton seem himself that morning? Any sign he was unwell or uneasy?" Miss Grey shook her head. "He was his usual self, gruff, demanding. Snapped at Tommy for setting the cup down too hard. He was reading his paper, muttering about some business deal. I didn't catch the details, but he seemed preoccupied." Miss Marple nodded, setting her cup down with care. "You've given me much to think about," she said, "and your Darjeeling is delightful. I must tell Mrs. Bantry to visit you for a chat. She'd enjoy your company." Miss Grey's expression softened, though her eyes remained sharp. "You're kind to say so, Miss Marple. But I'll tell you this, there's more to this business than meets the eye. Ashton wasn't a man to die quietly, and someone made sure he didn't." As Miss Marple rose to leave, her gaze lingered on Miss Grey's notebook, its pages filled with neat, angular script. "You keep a record of things, I see," she said lightly. "A wise habit." Miss Grey's lips twitched, almost a smile. "It helps me remember," she said. "People think I'm nosy, but I like to know what's what." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped back into the lane, the evening air cool against her cheeks. As she walked toward Gossington Hall, her mind sifted through Miss Grey's words. The spinster's account of Redding lingering outside the willow was significant. His denial of being near the tea-room now seemed less certain. And Clara's clatter in the kitchen, her pale face, her haste to wash the teapot, these were threads that wove together, hinting at something deliberate, something planned. Miss Marple thought of her own village, where a dropped teacup had once revealed a motive for theft. "Small sounds," she murmured, "can speak volumes." The puzzle was taking shape, but it was incomplete. Redding's presence, Clara's nervousness, Tommy's innocence, and now Miss Grey's keen observations, all pointed to the willow tea-room as the heart of the mystery. But the poison, Miss Marple knew, was not just in the tea. It was in the relationships, the grudges, the secrets that simmered beneath Saint. Mary's quiet surface. Her next step, she decided, would be to revisit the tea-room, to look again at that teapot and its faint telling scratch. Chapter 8. A pattern emerges. The parlour at Gossington Hall was a haven of warmth as twilight settled over St. Mary's, the fire casting flickering shadows across the floral wallpaper. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed armchair, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. The pale pink shawl now nearly complete in her lap. The air held the faint scent of beeswax and Mrs. Bantry's rosewater perfume, but Miss Marple's thoughts were far from the cosy domesticity of the room. Her mind was a loom, weaving together the threads of the Ashton case, Clara's trembling hands, Tommy's wounded pride, Redding's bitter grudge, and Miss Grey's sharp-eyed observations. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but it was the pattern she knew that would reveal the truth. Mrs. Bantry, bustling in with a tray of tea and biscuits, broke the silence. "Jane, you've been quiet all evening," she said, setting the tray on the table with a clink. "You're thinking about that dreadful business at the Willow, aren't you? Have you made any sense of it?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "I'm beginning to, Dolly," she said softly. "But it's rather like knitting, you see. One must follow the pattern carefully, or the whole thing unravels. And this pattern, it's intricate, but it's there." Mrs. Bantry poured the tea, her brow furrowed. "Intricate? It's a muddle if you ask me. Poison in a teacup, in broad daylight. Who could have done it? Clara? Tommy? That Redding fellow?" Miss Marple accepted her cup, her fingers brushing the warm china. "That's the question, isn't it?" she said, "but let's consider what we know." Inspector Craddock was kind enough to share the coroner's report this afternoon. Cyanide, they say, in Mr. Ashton's tea. A swift, deadly dose, administered in that very public tea-room. Now, cyanide is not a common thing to come by, nor is it easy to slip into a cup unnoticed. It suggests planning, Dolly, and a certain boldness. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Boldness! In St. Mary's! Oh, Jane, it's too awful to think about." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her mind racing. "Awful, yes, but not impossible. Let's look at our suspects. Mrs. Henshaw, Clara, had the best opportunity. She prepared the tea herself, poured it from a locked caddy, and used a teapot reserved for Ashton. She insists she's innocent, and her distress seems genuine, but distress can hide many things. In my village, there was a Mrs. Green so overcome with grief at her husband's death, yet it turned out she'd been planning it for months. Mrs. Bantry gasped, nearly spilling her tea. "You don't think, Clara—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that we must consider all possibilities. Clara had access, but her motive is unclear. Ashton's attentions flattered her, perhaps, but was that enough to drive her to murder? Or was there something more, something we haven't yet seen?" She set her cup down, her needles resuming their soft click-click. "Then there's Tommy Pierce, the waiter. A good lad by all accounts, but young, with a temper. Ashton humiliated him, and youth can be impulsive. Yet Tommy says he only carried the tray, never touched the tea itself. And Poison Dolly is not impulsive. It's deliberate, patient. I don't see Tommy in that light, though he bears watching." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple. "And Lawrence Redding?" "Everyone says he hated Ashton." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "Redding's motive is the strongest, his business ruined, his pride wounded. And Miss Grey saw him lingering outside the willow that morning, despite his claim to the contrary. He supplies the tea, too, which is curious. If the poison was in the leaves, he'd have had the means. But Clara checks every batch, and the caddy is locked. How could he tamper with it without her noticing? And why poison Ashton in such a public way, when their feud was already the talk of the village?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You think he didn't do it? I think," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing, "that Redding's anger is too loud, too visible. Poison is a quiet crime, Dolly. It whispers, not shouts. And then there's Miss Grey's account. A clatter in the kitchen, Clara's pale face, the teapot washed so quickly. These are the details that matter. The teapot in particular keeps coming back to me. That scratch on its spout, it's a small thing, but small things can be telling." Mrs. Bantry shivered, though the room was warm. "You're giving me goosebumps, Jane." What about Ashton himself? Could it have been someone from outside the village? He was a financier, after all. He must have had enemies in London. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. A possibility, certainly. Men like Ashton leave trails. Debts, rivalries, broken promises. But cyanide in a teacup, in a village tea-room, feels personal, don't you think? It's not the act of a stranger passing through. It's someone who knew Ashton's habits, his love of Earl Grey, his daily ritual at the willow. Someone who could slip into that routine without raising suspicion. She leaned back, her needles moving faster now, as if keeping pace with her thoughts. "There's a pattern here, Dolly. Clara's care with the tea, Tommy's tray, Redding's tea leaves, Miss Grey's watchful eyes. It all centres on the willow tea-room. On that moment when the tea was poured, the poison wasn't in the cup, I'm certain of it. It was in the pot, or perhaps the leaves themselves. But how it got there, and who put it there, that's the knot we must untie." Mrs. Bantry stared, her biscuit untouched. "You're awfully calm about it, Jane. If I were poking into a murder, I'd be a nervous wreck." Miss Marple smiled, a small, knowing smile. "It's merely a matter of looking at things clearly, Dolly. People are not so mysterious as they seem. They act according to their natures, and those natures leave traces. Like a dropped stitch, you see. It shows you where the pattern went wrong." She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think I shall ask Inspector Craddock to let me see that teapot again. And perhaps a word with Miss Grey, to confirm her story about Reading. The truth, I find, is often in the things people overlook." Mrs. Bantry watched her go, a mixture of awe and unease in her eyes. "Be careful, Jane," she called. "Poisoners are dangerous people." Miss Marple paused at the door, her hand on the knob. "They are," she agreed, her voice soft but firm. "But so is the truth, Dolly. And I mean to find it." As she stepped into the cool evening air, Miss Marple's mind was alight with the emerging pattern. The tea-room, with its rituals and rivalries, was the stage, and the teapot, she felt, was the key. Clara, Tommy, Reading, Miss Grey. Each played a role. But it was the interplay of their motives and opportunities that would reveal the killer. "It's not the tea," she murmured, her breath misting in the dusk, "but the moment it was poured. And that moment, I think, will tell us everything." Chapter 9. The Hidden Grudge. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary's, veiling the village in a gauzy shroud as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to the Willow tea-room. Her black umbrella, held more for propriety than necessity, tapped lightly against the cobblestones, and her eyes, sharp beneath the brim of her hat, scanned the quiet street. The village was stirring, milk bottles clinked on doorsteps, and a baker's boy cycled past with a basket of fresh loaves. But Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on the threads of the Ashton case, now weaving into a pattern she could almost grasp. Clara's nervousness, Tommy's resentment, Reading's fury, and Miss Grey's watchful eyes had all pointed to the tea-room. But a new question had begun to nag at her. What lay beneath Gerald Ashton's polished exterior? A man like that, she knew, carried secrets as surely as he carried wealth. Inside the Willow tea-room, the air was warm with the scent of baking scones, though the usual bustle was subdued. Only a few customers sat at the tables, their conversations hushed, as if the shadow of Ashton's death still lingered. Clara Henshaw stood behind the counter, arranging a tray of teacups with a precision that betrayed her unease. Her auburn hair was pinned tightly, but a stray curl had escaped, and her hands moved with a faint tremor. Miss Marple, choosing a table near the window, greeted her with a smile as warm as the morning sun. "Good morning, Mrs. Henshaw," she said, setting her umbrella against the chair. "I thought I'd try your Assam today. Mrs. Bantry speaks so highly of it, and I'm in need of something robust after my walk." Clara's lips curved into a strained smile, and she nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple, I'll have Tommy bring it over." Her voice was polite, but her eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. As Clara busied herself with the tea, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the silver teapot on the shelf, its faint scratch catching the light. She had asked Inspector Craddock to let her examine it again, but for now she was content to observe Clara, whose every movement seemed laced with tension. The tea-room, Miss Marple thought, was more than a business to Clara. It was her sanctuary, her pride, and perhaps her vulnerability. A casual remark, she decided, might loosen the threads of that tension. "Your tea-room is such a comfort to the village," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational as Clara brought the Assam herself, setting the cup down with care. "I imagine Mr. Ashton felt the same, coming here every day. Did he ever speak of his life before Saint? Mary's? His wife, perhaps?" Clara's hand froze on the teapot, and a flush crept into her cheeks. "His wife," she said, her voice catching. He mentioned her once or twice. Eleanor, her name was. He said she loved tea too, especially Earl Grey. It was why he always ordered it, I think, a sort of tribute. She looked away, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. "How touching," she said. "It must have been a comfort to him sitting here, remembering her. Though I hear she had a sad life." Poor thing, Clara's flush deepened, and she busied herself with a cloth, wiping an already spotless counter. "I wouldn't know about that," she said quickly. "He didn't talk much about her. Just said she was delicate, that she didn't cope well with his way of life." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea, its bold flavour grounding her thoughts. Men like Mr. "Ashton often leave a mark," she said. "In my village we had a gentleman, Mr. Fortescue, who was much the same, charming when he wished, but hard on those closest to him. His wife suffered for it, quietly, as wives sometimes do." Clara's hands stilled, and for a moment her eyes met Miss Marple's, a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or recognition, passing through them. "I suppose some men are like that," she said softly, "but Mr. Ashton was kind to me. He made me feel noticed." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle understanding, though her mind was racing. Clara's words, her hesitation, her blush, they hinted at a deeper connection to Ashton, one that went beyond a customer's flattery. But there was something else, something in that mention of Eleanor Ashton that tugged at Miss Marple's memory. She set her cup down and decided to return to Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry might shed more light on Eleanor's story. Back in the parlour, with the fire crackling and the scent of lavender lingering, Miss Marple found Mrs. Bantry leafing through a gardening catalogue, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Jane, you're back early," she said, looking up. Did Clara confess to murder over a cup of Assam? Miss Marple chuckled, settling into her armchair and picking up her knitting. "Not quite, Dolly." But she said something curious about Ashton's wife, Eleanor. "You mentioned she was delicate, broken by his cruelty. Do you know more about her? Perhaps something from before they came to St. Mary's?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit up, eager to share the village lore. "Oh, Eleanor was a beauty, Jane, but fragile, like porcelain. She grew up in a village not far from here. Netherby, I think. Came from a good family, but not wealthy. Ashton swept her off her feet, they say, with his money and charm. But it wasn't a happy marriage. There was talk of, well, not violence, but coldness. He controlled everything, her friends, her money, even her letters. And there was a young man, before Ashton, who loved her dearly. Broke his heart when she married. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. A young man? Do you know who he was? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping. Lawrence Redding, Jane. They were sweethearts in their youth, before Ashton came along. Redding was just starting his tea business then, full of dreams. When Eleanor chose Ashton, it crushed him. And then Ashton's dealings ruined Redding's shop years later. It's no wonder he hated the man. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind fitting this new piece into the puzzle. Redding and Eleanor, she murmured. A personal grudge then, not just business. That changes things, Dolly. A man who loses love and livelihood to the same enemy might well turn to desperate measures. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her catalogue forgotten. You think Redding poisoned Ashton? Because of Eleanor. I think, Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting, that love, when it curdles, can be as deadly as any poison. Redding's anger in the square, his lingering near the willow, his tea in Clara's caddy, it all points to opportunity, and now we have a deeper motive. But we must be careful. The poison was in the tea and Clara poured it. Redding's access to the leaves makes him a possibility, but how did he get past that locked caddy? She leaned back, her needles clicking steadily. And Clara, her devotion to Ashton, her nervousness, her quick washing of the teapot. There's something there, Dolly. Something she's not saying. Perhaps she knew more about Ashton's past than she lets on. Or perhaps someone used her, knowing her trust in Redding's tea. Mrs. Bantry stared, her tea cooling untouched. Jane, you're making my head spin. What will you do next? Miss Marple smiled, a small, knowing smile. I shall ask Inspector Craddock to let me see that teapot again. And I think another word with Miss Grey might be in order. She saw Redding outside the willow, and her ears are as sharp as her eyes. The truth, Dolly, is like a tea leaf. It rises to the surface if you stir gently enough. As she returned to her knitting, Miss Marple's mind was alight with the hidden grudge she had uncovered. Redding's love for Eleanor, broken by Ashton's cruelty, added a layer of venom to his motive. But the teapot, the caddy in Clara's trembling hands still held secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to coax them into the light. Chapter 10. The Teapot's Secret. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village of St. Mary's, its golden light filtering through the mist that clung to the rooftops. Miss Jane Marple, her black coat neatly buttoned and her umbrella tucked under her arm, made her way to the police station. A small brick building tucked behind the village hall. Inspector Craddock had agreed to let her examine the silver teapot from the willow tea room once more. And Miss Marple, with her knack for noticing the overlooked, felt certain that this unassuming object held the key to Gerald Ashton's murder. Her mind was a whirl of threads, Clara's flushed cheeks, Tommy's nervous glances, Redding's deep-seated grudge, and Miss Grey's sharp observations. But the teapot, with its faint scratch and hasty washing, was the knot that tied them together. Inside the station, the air smelled of ink and polished wood, and a young constable led her to a small evidence room where the teapot sat on a table, sealed in a clear bag. Inspector Craddock, his weathered face creased with curiosity, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope you're not expecting this teapot to confess. It's been cleaned, as you know, Mrs. Henshaw's doing before we could stop her." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Teapots don't speak, Inspector, but they do tell stories, if you know how to listen. May I?" She gestured to the bag, and Craddock, with a bemused shrug, handed it to her. She turned the teapot carefully, her gloved fingers tracing its smooth silver surface. The scratch on the spout was still there, a hairline mark no wider than a needle's breadth, but her attention was drawn to the interior, visible through the open lid. A faint discoloration clung to the inner rim, a shadow of residue that the hasty washing had not entirely erased. She leaned closer, her nose detecting a trace of something bitter, not quite the almond-like scent of cyanide, but something chemical, persistent. "Curious," she murmured, her voice soft but sharp with interest, This wasn't entirely cleaned, Inspector. There's something here. Something overlooked. Craddock frowned, peering over her shoulder. The lab tested it, he said. No cyanide, just traces of tea. Mrs. Henshaw's thorough, I'll give her that. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, though her expression remained serene. Thorough, yes, but not perfect. In my village, Saint, Mary Mead, we had a case once, a silver jug, polished to a shine, yet it held a secret in its seams. I wonder if you might have this tested again, for something other than cyanide. A residue, perhaps, that might tell us how the poison was introduced. Craddock raised an eyebrow but jotted a note. You think the poison was in the teapot, not the tea leaves? I think, Miss Marple said, handing the teapot back, that the teapot was the vessel, quite literally. Clara poured the tea. Tommy carried it, but the poison was already waiting. The question is how it got there, and who placed it. She stepped back, her mind racing as she recalled her conversations. Clara's insistence on preparing Ashton's tea herself, her quick washing of the teapot, her flushed reaction to questions about Eleanor Ashton. Tommy's claim that he only carried the tray, never touching the tea. Redding's supply of the Earl Grey, sealed in tins, yet his lingering presence outside the Willow, as noted by Miss Grey, and Miss Grey's own account of a clatter in the kitchen, a moment of disarray before the fatal tea was served. Each detail pointed to the teapot as the stage for the crime, but the actor remained elusive. As she left the station, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the locked caddy, the key that hung behind Clara's counter, and the tea leaves supplied by Redding. Clara had sworn she checked every batch, and Redding claimed his tins were sealed, but the residue in the teapot suggested a different story. A story of opportunity seized in a fleeting moment. She pictured the tea room's kitchen, its shelves of gleaming utensils, the clatter Miss Grey had heard. A dropped spoon, Clara had said, but Miss Marple wondered if it was something else. A vial, perhaps, or a packet of poison, slipped into the teapot spout during a moment of distraction. She paused on the village green, her umbrella tapping the ground as she considered her next move. Redding's motive was the strongest, his love for Eleanor, shattered by Ashton's cruelty, compounded by the ruin of his business. Yet his access to the teapot was limited, unless he had found a way into the tea-room stores. Clara, with her key and her rituals, was the gatekeeper, but her devotion to Ashton made murder seem unlikely, unless that devotion had turned to betrayal. Tommy, young and resentful, lacked the patience for such a calculated act, but he was there, in the thick of it, carrying the tray. And Miss Grey, with her notebooks and her eagle eyes, might have seen more than she realized. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her mind settling on a plan. I shall return to the Willow, she murmured, and speak with Clara again. But first, a word with Miss Grey. She heard that clatter, and she saw Redding outside. Her memory, I think, will be the thread that pulls this knot apart. As she set off toward Rose Cottage, the mist began to lift, revealing the village in sharp relief. The Willow tea room loomed in her thoughts, its silver teapot a silent witness to a crime that was both bold and subtle. The poison, she said softly, her breath misting in the cool air, wasn't in the cup, it was in the pot. And the pot, I believe, will tell us who. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The Willow tea room, bathed in the soft light of a late afternoon sun, stood as a quiet sentinel in the heart of St. Mary's. Its windows gleamed with an almost defiant brightness, as if determined to dispel the shadow of Gerald Ashton's death. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of fresh scones and brewing tea, but the usual hum of conversation was absent, replaced by a tension that clung to the starched tablecloths and polished silver. Miss Jane Marple had arranged, with Inspector Craddock's reluctant approval, to gather the key figures in the Ashton case: Clara Henshaw, Tommy Pierce, Lawrence Redding, and Miss Lavinia Gray, for what she called a little chat. Her demeanour was as gentle as ever, but her eyes, bright and unyielding behind her spectacles, carried the weight of certainty. The tea-room had been closed to the public for the occasion, and the four suspects sat at a large round table. Near the centre of the room, their faces a study in contrasts. Clara's pale and tremulous, Tommy's flushed and fidgety, Redding's dark with defiance, and Miss Gray's sharp with curiosity. Inspector Craddock stood by the door, his notebook in hand, watching Miss Marple with a mix of scepticism and admiration. Miss Marple, her black handbag resting on the table and her hands folded neatly, surveyed the group with the calm assurance of a schoolmistress addressing her class. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft but carrying a quiet authority. "I know this has been a trying time with Mr. Ashton's death casting such a shadow over the village. But I believe we're close to understanding what happened that morning, and I thought it best to discuss it here, where it all began." Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes darting to the silver teapot on the counter, now returned from the police station. "I've told you everything, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "I poured the tea myself. I'd never harm Mr. Ashton. He was kind to me." Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle but unwavering. "Of course, my dear, your devotion to this tea-room and to Mr. Ashton's tea is clear, but let us go over the facts, shall we? Mr. Ashton died of cyanide poisoning, his tea laced with a deadly dose. The tea came from your locked caddy, Mrs. Henshaw, and was poured from a silver teapot you reserved for him. Tommy, you carried the tray to his table, and no one else approached it. Is that correct?" Tommy nodded, his freckles stark against his pale face. "Yes, ma'am. I just set it down, like always. I didn't touch the tea." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Redding, who sat with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. "And you, Mr. Redding, supply the Earl Grey for the willow. You had a deep grievance against Mr. Ashton, not just for ruining your business, but for taking Eleanor, your childhood sweetheart, and breaking her with his cruelty." Redding's eyes flashed, and he leaned forward, his voice low and fierce. "I won't deny I hated him. He deserved what he got, for what he did to Eleanor and to me. But I didn't poison him. My tea's clean. I seal every tin myself." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was as sharp as ever. "I believe you, Mr. Redding, when you say your tea was clean, but I also believe Miss Gray, who saw you lingering outside the willow that morning, despite your claim to the contrary." Miss Gray, her notebook clutched tightly, nodded primly. "I did see him, Miss Marple. Just before 10, standing by the door, looking inside. I thought it odd, given their history." Redding's face darkened, but he said nothing, his hands clenching into fists. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The poison, you see, was not in the tea leaves, nor in the cup. It was in the teapot itself, a residue, faint but present, that the police missed because Mrs. Henshaw washed it so quickly. But not quickly enough. A trace remained, and it tells us the poison was placed there before the tea was poured. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But I swear I didn't put anything in the teapot. I know you didn't, my dear, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. But someone did. And that someone knew Mr. Ashton's habits, knew he would drink from that teapot, and knew how to get the poison into it without arousing suspicion. Her eyes moved to Redding, calm but piercing. Mr. Redding, you were seen outside the willow, but I believe you were also inside, briefly, in the storeroom, 3 days before the murder. Miss Grey, you mentioned a delivery from the Saffron Leaf that week, did you not? Miss Grey's eyes widened, and she flipped open her notebook. Yes, on Tuesday. I saw Mr. Redding bring a crate of tea to the back door. He spoke to Clara, then left. Miss Marple nodded. And in that moment, Mr. Redding, you slipped into the storeroom while Clara was distracted. You tampered with the teapot, lacing its spout with a cyanide compound, slow to dissolve, but deadly when steeped with hot tea. You knew Ashton's ritual, knew Clara would use that teapot for him alone. It was a patient plan, Mr. Redding, born of a hatred that burned for years. First for Eleanor, then for your business. Redding's face paled, and he rose, his chair scraping the floor. That's nonsense! You've no proof! None! I wasn't in the storeroom, and I didn't touch that teapot. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, cutting through his bluster. But you were, Mr. Redding. The scratch on the spout, made by a tool, perhaps a knife, as you worked the poison into place. And Miss Grey's notebook, so meticulous, places you at the willow when you claim to be elsewhere. Your hatred for Ashton was no secret, but it was deeper than business, wasn't it? Eleanor's death broke something in you, and Ashton's interference with your shop was the final straw. Redding's defiance crumbled, his shoulders sagging as he sank back into his chair. He took everything, he whispered, his voice raw. Eleanor, my future, my pride. I wanted him to suffer, like she did. I laced the teapot, just a pinch, enough to make him pay. His voice broke, and he covered his face with his hands. Clara sobbed, and Tommy stared, wide-eyed. Miss Grey's lips pursed, her pen poised over her notebook. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his expression grim. Lawrence Redding, you're under arrest for the murder of Gerald Ashton. As Redding was led away, Miss Marple rose, her handbag in hand. A sad business, she said softly, her eyes lingering on the teapot. But truth, like tea, must be steeped carefully to reveal its flavour. Chapter 12. The Village Settles. The evening light draped Saint. Mary's in a gentle glow, the village settling into its familiar rhythm, as the sun dipped below the horizon. The church spire cast a long shadow across the green, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the crisp autumn air. At Gossington Hall, Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire in Mrs. Bantry's parlour, her knitting needles moving with their steady, soothing rhythm. The pale pink shawl, now complete, lay folded neatly in her lap, a testament to the quiet hours spent unravelling the mystery of Gerald Ashton's death. The fire crackled, casting flickering patterns on the walls, and Mrs. Bantry, perched on the sofa with a cup of tea, watched her friend with a mixture of awe and curiosity. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, setting her cup down with a clink. "You've done it again. Solved a murder right under our noses. I still can't believe it was Lawrence Redding. Poison in a teapot. Such a dreadful thing. How did you know?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, her smile as serene as ever. "It was the teapot, Dolly," she said softly. "It always came back to that. The scratch on the spout, the residue the police overlooked, Clara's haste to wash it. These were the threads that told the story. And Mr. Redding's hatred, so deep and personal, was the needle that wove them together." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. "But how did he manage it?" Clara's caddy was locked, and she checked the tea herself. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she folded her hands, her voice calm but precise. "Redding didn't tamper with the tea leaves, Dolly. That would have been too risky, with Clara's careful inspections. No, he used the teapot, Ashton's teapot, reserved for his Earl Grey. During a delivery to the Willow, he slipped into the storeroom just for a moment while Clara was distracted. A pinch of cyanide, worked into the spout with a knife, left a residue that dissolved slowly when the hot tea was poured. It was clever, patient, and very personal. He knew Ashton's habits, knew the teapot would be used, and knew Clara's trust in him as a supplier would blind her to the possibility. Mrs. Bantry shivered, though the room was warm. "And all because of Eleanor," she said. "Poor woman, caught between two men like that. Ashton's cruelty, Redding's vengeance. It's like something out of a novel." Miss Marple nodded, her expression tinged with sadness. "Love, when it turns to hate, is a powerful poison, Dolly. Redding lost Eleanor to Ashton's charm, then watched her fade under his cruelty. When Ashton ruined his business years later, it was too much. The teapot was his weapon, the tea room his stage. But he underestimated Miss Grey's eyes and Clara's routines and perhaps an old lady's curiosity." Mrs. Bantry laughed, a nervous sound. "You're no ordinary old lady, Jane. The village is buzzing. Clara's reopened the Willow, and Tommy's back to work, dreaming of university. Even Miss Grey's, scribbling away, no doubt filling her notebook with this tale. But what about Clara?" She was so shaken Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Clara's stronger than she seems." She poured Ashton's tea with care, never suspecting the teapot's secret. Her distress was real, but it was guilt over her trust in Redding, not murder. "She'll carry on, Dolly, as women do. The Willow tea room is her heart, and hearts mend, given time." She rose, smoothing her skirt, and glanced at the window, where the village lay quiet under the deepening dusk. "Poison," she said softly, "is a coward's weapon, but it speaks loudly of the heart. Redding's heart was broken, and he let it lead him to murder. But Saint, Mary's will heal, as villages do, tucking its secrets away like tea leaves in a tin." Mrs. Bantry watched her, her tea forgotten. "You're remarkable, Jane. Will you stay a bit longer? The village feels safer with you here." Miss Marple smiled, picking up her shawl and folding it with care. "Perhaps a day or two, Dolly. But Saint, Mary Mead calls me back. There's always a mystery somewhere, you know, even in the quietest places." As she stepped toward the door, her knitting bag in hand, the firelight caught her eyes, bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. Outside, the village settled into its evening rituals, the Willow tea room's windows glowing softly, a beacon of comfort restored. And Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and unyielding mind, walked into the night, ready for whatever secrets the next day might bring.